So good morning and welcome to my fourth talk in the series on grief today, where we're going to talk about dysfunctional or complicated grief and how will you know if you or someone that close to you is bereaved is actually in difficulty. So what are the danger signs? So we'll talk about the symptoms, what maybe to do about it, what professional help to get. So it'll be a little bit of a guideline for you. I welcome those of you who are joining me live, and I thank you so much for the comments that have come to me in subsequent viewings of my previous videos, and I welcome them. I would really like to start a conversation surrounding questions that you might have or comments that you might have about grieving. So just to introduce myself again, my name is Sherry Forsyth and I'm a life coach practicing in South Africa. One of the areas that I specialize in is the whole topic of grieving, mainly in fact due to our own personal loss of our youngest daughter, Kerry, when she was 9 years old. So I sadly didn't know about this thing called dysfunctional grief, and I wished that I had. And I think many people go into dysfunctional or complicated grief because they don't really know how to negotiate the whole process of grieving. So you'll notice throughout this video, I interchange the words of dysfunctional and complicated grief. It's basically the same thing. So what is it actually? Dysfunctional or complicated grief means essentially that you get stuck, as we were discussing in the stages last session. You get stuck in one of the stages of grieving. But essentially, dysfunctional or complicated grief means you don't actually get over the loss. You don't move through that deep valley, and you don't start moving up the other side in order to heal. So when you get stuck in one of those symptoms, we often don't note if we're the person involved. And if we are somebody who's a close friend of someone who is bereaved and maybe suffering from dysfunctional grief, we can't recognize it and we don't really know what to do. Hence me talking about dysfunctional grief today. So there are a lot of quite academic definitions of what dysfunctional grief is, how long one should be suffering from a particular symptom before you can say, oh, well, maybe I need to get some help. So really it's, as far as the length of time one is suffering, many people say if it's 6 months or longer that you are suffering from the same symptom. Some people put it to a year and longer. The jury is out. You know yourself, and you also know your friend or loved one who is suffering from dysfunctional grief. So it can appear, dysfunctional grief can appear either as a complete lack of mourning. In other words, quite detached. You kind of carrying on as if nothing has happened. In other words, you're suppressing all that emotion. Or on the other hand, dysfunctional grief can appear as incredibly volatile, can't stop crying, can't get your life together. And so in other words, you are dysfunctional as a person. And so really complicated grief is like being in the initial stages that we feel when we're grieving, but for a very extended period. Okay, so the initial shock, denial, anger, whatever it may be, it kind of never goes away. We never heal from that. We never move on from that, move forward from that into a state of acceptance of the death. So one thing we have to be very careful of is if we are wanting to help somebody who might be suffering from what we think is dysfunctional grief, firstly is to remember again, which I say over and over, the process of grieving is very personal. And what you think might be a little bit dysfunctional may not be so for the person who's grieving. I take, for example, the fact that many people will continue to speak to the loved one who has died. And that is a completely normal thing to do. But however, if I had to tell most of my friends that, I used to speak to Kerry a lot after she died, I think they would definitely know I'd lost my marbles. So I don't see that as being particularly dysfunctional. However, if I invited people to my home and it's a year after the loss of Kerry, and I still have her place laid at the dining room table while we are having dinner, that could be a bit of an issue. So there's a very fine line between normal grieving and dysfunctional grief. The other thing we need to take into account is different cultural requirements that we might not necessarily know about, and we therefore think people are being dysfunctional when in fact they're just following what their culture dictates. So to be very aware of that. So my general definition of dysfunctional grief, as I've simplified it a lot, is if the behavior that you are exhibiting as the person who is mourning is harmful either to you or others that are close to you. Okay, so the behavior is harmful either to you or to others that are close to you. And it may be brand new behavior which has manifested after the loss of that you've experienced, or it could be a long-term behavior which has just got progressively worse, and it's been catalyzed by the grieving process. So for me, that's very real. Make sure that in what you are doing, you are not harming others or yourself. And then you're likely to kind of stay on the right road, the straight and narrow. So what makes determining whether grief is dysfunctional or not is that many of the symptoms of dysfunctional grief, which we're going to go into shortly, are very similar to those that we experience initially during the loss of our loved one. And so when do you draw the line is often the problem. So the first thing is that when somebody is suffering from dysfunctional grief, just like somebody who's suffering from depression, the last thing they need to hear is they must just snap out of it or pull themselves together and get on with life, because they can't. Okay, they cannot do that, just like a person who's suffering from depression can't do it either. It is like asking a car to run with no petrol. So what the person who is possibly suffering from dysfunctional grief needs is huge understanding, compassion, care, and support. So approximately 10 to 20% of people who have been bereaved will have the potential of tipping over into complicated or dysfunctional grief. So 10 to 20%, that's 1 out of 10 people, or 2 out of 10, which is quite a lot. And this is a very unrecognized condition. As I said, when we lost our daughter, I didn't even know about it. So let's have a look at some of the symptoms. I have written them up, so if you're wanting to make a list of them, you've at least got them in front of you. So the first one is extreme focus on the death, on the factors surrounding it, on the fact that person is no longer with you. And the word here to concentrate on is extreme focus. Okay, when you have the extreme focus in the days and weeks after the loss, that's completely normal. But if that same intensity of focus is still prevalent months and possibly years later, we have a problem. Okay, the second symptom is intense longing. Now, obviously, we are going to experience that because the person that we loved, the person that died, we really loved. But with the passage of time, as you are working through the different stages of grief, and as you're going through the valley and through the dark night of the soul at the bottom, as we discussed last time, one does generally start moving up the other side. But if you are suffering from dysfunctional grief, you stay in that intense longing. You can't ever move forward from it. And many people feel that if they do start moving forward, they're not honoring their loved one. They feel that if they're moving forward, they are going to forget them. So please know that we can still long for them. I mean, it's 16 years later, nearly 16 and a half years later, and there's still days when I feel that intense longing, but it might be for 5 minutes. Okay, so dysfunctional grief is when it is intense and it doesn't seem to be going away. I hope that makes sense. It's linked to the third one, which is a problem accepting that the person has actually died. And so we kind of are living in a bit of a make-believe world where we are not accepting the reality of the situation. And that can manifest in many different ways. Too many to mention, but I leave it with you. You will know. Our old friend, numbness. Okay, now normally numbness is part of the grieving process initially. It becomes dysfunctional grief when 6 months or a year later, in fact, I would put it more at a year or longer for numbness, you're still feeling completely numb. In other words, there are no emotions. Okay, because by this time, your body's physiology, in other words, all those chemicals that make you numb so that you can cope with the loss, have long gone. So this numbness is now an emotional numbness, not a physical one. The next symptom is preoccupation with the sorrow. So in other words, you can't see anything without it being in the context of my sorrow. Your identity becomes invested in, I am the wife who's lost her husband. I am the mother who lost her child. And there's a total preoccupation. It kind of seeps into every area of your life. So normal conversation can't even really happen because you will always bring it back to the sorrow that you are experiencing. The next symptom is bitterness and anger, but it's long term. It doesn't seem to go away. So suddenly you become very angry, you have no hope, you're very bitter that it happened to you. Why didn't it happen to somebody else? And again, it's quite an unrealistic perception of the situation. So I just want to remind you, as usual, that grief is a very personal process, and you won't necessarily suffer from all of these symptoms. There might only be one. So we're going to carry on with the list. This is a big one, an inability to enjoy life, which is linked with the next one, which is depression. In other words, we can't see the happiness, we can't see the joy. Once again, initially when we experience a loss, that is very much part of where we are. How can we be joyful? But over time, that joy we start reinvesting with life. And that joy and happiness does return, even though we might be somewhat weathered and altered. But if there's a complete inability to enjoy life, which is really what depression is about, then we're not suffering anymore just from sadness. It has then possibly become a clinical depression, which then needs to be medicated. Okay, and as we said in the last series, the last talk, there's a difference between sadness and depression. So we're not talking sadness, we're talking clinical, in other words, physiological depression. there's been a depletion of the chemicals needed to help us to function. Right, moving along then, we can't do our normal routine. So the things that we normally do, which will include, sadly, our chores, washing our clothes, going to the grocery shop, cooking food, going to our job, all of those things that are a normal part of who we were prior to the death, we don't resume. Okay, and that's often a really big indicator of dysfunctional grief. The normal routines are no longer there. And part of that can be the lack of personal hygiene. So even if prior to you were very clean and made up and whatever, very often if your grief is dysfunctional long term, we're talking about, you have no personal hygiene. Okay, then we look at social withdrawal. So in other words, you don't re-engage with your friends. Every time you're invited out, there's an excuse. You stay at home. You like to be on your own, but not in a healthy way. Okay, not in a healthy way. So, and you will see it in the way they are. I describe it as people, they look heavy. Their soul looks heavy. And that's often because of this incredible sadness, this staying at home on your own, because you actually have no desire to be with other people. You have no desire to get their support. So that is quite a big one, which is linked to the lack of meaning and purpose in your life. Things that you used to love, whether you were an artist or whether you loved your job, loved being a grandmother, whatever it may be that gave your life meaning and purpose. Suddenly you're not doing that anymore. Okay, you're not doing that thing that was vitally important to you. Irritability, long term, is an issue. And, as I mentioned before, if we are suffering with something or under stress, irritability is usually there. So dysfunctional or complicated grief indicates that our body is still stressed. It hasn't healed. We haven't moved forward. So our body and our minds are locked in a state of stress, hence the irritability. Okay, and the last one is that we can't trust others. And this comes about because we can't trust ourselves anymore. We didn't really know what to do when our loved one died. We didn't have the answers to the questions. We went through all those stages that were new to us. And so because we can't trust ourselves, we also find that we can't trust others. So those are some of the symptoms. It's not a complete list. If you should have any symptoms that you are aware of, either from yourself or somebody else, and you would like me to add that to the list for future reference for my future workshops, please feel free to drop it in the comments box underneath the video, and I will gladly do that. What we're wanting is the more information that we have about grieving, the better. So getting back to the symptoms of grieving, how will I know if I'm in trouble? As I mentioned before, it's when I harm either myself or someone else with the behavior that I'm exhibiting. Okay. I also got very wise counsel from the homeopath that I go to, Dr. Georgie McCrease. I was concerned about my husband and our remaining daughter, Kathleen, because they're very private. And they always used to roll their eyes because I was the one who would always ask them, how are you doing? Are you okay? And it would kind of be, roll your eyes. Oh, Mum, you're so pathetic. So how would I know if they were battling? And so Georgie came with these very, very wise words. And she said, anything that they do in extreme, which is new, is likely to indicate that they may be battling a little bit with the grief. So once again, if that new extreme behavior becomes long-term, then it changes from then battling a little bit with grief actually to becoming dysfunctional grief. Okay, and that thing that they do in extreme can also be a healthy thing. For example, like exercise or working too hard at school if they're a child, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But when it is not part of their nature and it becomes extreme, it becomes unhealthy for them. So I set great store by that definition, and I thank Georgie for her wisdom and her support over the many years. All right, so those are kind of the symptoms that one experiences when you are experiencing dysfunctional or complicated grief. So what causes this? Do we know? Does research show why some people go into complicated grief and others don't? And the simple answer is the jury is out. Okay, there's no definite cause for complicated grief or not. It seems to be a combination of who you are, what kind of personality you have, what is in your genes, possibly the nature of the death, the way you work through things, your psychological state at the time. So there are lots of factors that can contribute to it, but there's no actual cause. So generally, we are hoping that we will move through the various stages as they will be for us. They'll be personal for us, different for each one of us, but that we move through those stages as we go down the valley. We move through the dark night of the soul and we come out at the other side. Okay, that's what we're hoping for. However, there are a few risk factors that are likely to enable, you're more likely to suffer from dysfunctional grief if there's one of the following risk factors, which I'm just going to read out. I don't have them on my flip chart. So in an unexpected or violent death, there's likely to be complicating factors and complicating emotions that can lead to dysfunctional grief. The second one is a suicide. There always are so many questions. How come didn't I recognize the symptoms? Why didn't I do more? Why didn't I know they were depressed, etc. So that kind of questioning can lead to dysfunctional grief. The third risk factor is lack of support from family or friends. So in other words, you're going it alone. And as I've mentioned before, it is an isolating process and it's very overwhelming because we don't know what we're doing. So those two things can tip us over into dysfunctional grief. The next risk factor is if you had traumatic childhood experiences like abuse or neglect, and you have the mindset that goes with that, that can make you more predisposed to suffer from a dysfunctional grief. If you had childhood separation anxiety, that is also a risk factor. In other words, the abandonment issues. The other thing that's a risk factor, we have spoken a little bit about it before, is if you have a very close relationship with the person who has died. The closer the relationship, the more likelihood of dysfunctional grief. So if a distant aunt or uncle dies, you're not likely to go into dysfunctional grief. But if your spouse, your parent, your child, your very dear friend dies, there's more of a chance. The second to last risk factor is being unprepared for the death. So in other words, a very sudden and unexpected death. Because there's no time to psychologically prepare yourself for the loss, it can tip over into dysfunctional grief. And the last one is a personal lack of emotional resiliency to any kind of changes or anything that's new. And that is just something that one has and was born with. The good news is that we can work a lot on increasing your emotional resilience. So those are the risk factors concerning dysfunctional grief. So how will you know if you need to see a doctor or a professional, or how will you know if your friend needs to go and see a doctor? So generally, it will be when they are suffering from some of these symptoms. It's quite a long time after the loss. You can see it's very harmful. The person has changed very dramatically and is no longer the person that they were. And they seem to be locked in this heaviness, the sadness, the inability to deal with this terrible thing that has happened to them. They don't have the energy to seem to want to work through it. So there are a few skills that one can start learning, and this is with or without the help of a professional. I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail because there's not scope in this video, but the skills that we're going to look at are to develop mindfulness, which is a big buzzword these days. There are lots of mindfulness practitioners, and there's even on the internet, you can go onto Google and download courses on mindfulness and meditation. We have to learn how to cope with our stress. So stress management is a big one. What is it? What do we do with it? We need to set goals, and I want to emphasize here very small goals. It might just be that I want to be able to go shopping this week for my groceries. I'm not talking about big, profound goals at all. They're just little things that will get us moving. It might be get out of bed and get dressed as a starting point. Okay, to learn relaxation techniques, there are lots of meditation, live meditations, and meditations you can listen to and download from YouTube. A really great guy is Jason Stevenson. His YouTube videos or audios are incredibly relaxing, and then it means you don't have to do any work. You just quietly listen to him guiding you. A big one, we need to return to enjoyable activity. So those things that we used to love to do, sometimes it's a bit hard because we might feel a bit socially awkward because we're arriving now without our spouse. But those things that we enjoy to do, try and reinvest with them as soon as possible, because it'll start you getting back onto a kind of a normal tack. And then lastly, sleeping well. When we're disturbed, we often don't sleep very well. And then everything is much bigger, much more dramatic, much worse. We just don't have the resilience to cope. So it's very important to be able to sleep well. And often as part of remedies for dysfunctional grief is the ability to sleep. And so lastly, we get to, if you ask for, if you see that you need professional help, the first step is if you are caring for someone who is maybe in dysfunctional grief, is just talk to them very gently and see what their response is. You know, they might be completely dismissive, which is a problem. They might be incredibly defensive, which is also a problem. So the first port of call is always just say, I'm really concerned about you because of, and then see what happens. But there are professionals that can help you, anything from psychologists that specialize in grief, trauma counselors, medical doctors. You need to possibly get antidepressants. Homeopaths are great. Psychologists who specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, in other words, CBT, are very successful when it comes to dysfunctional grief. And then the two more complementary and non-invasive procedures or processes. One is called EFT, which you can Google, Emotional Freedom Technique, even though it sounds like banking, EFT. And the second one is TRE, which is trauma release exercises. There are therapists who are trained in that and will teach you those processes, and both of them can help to unlock your grief. So, and that's really what we're wanting to do when it comes to the treatment for dysfunctional grief. It doesn't mean that you have to stay there at all. So I hope that you found this video to be of value. And I ask you to help me to shatter the silence on the whole topic of grief. So if you know somebody that this video possibly might help, I ask you please to share it so that we can start our little ripple in our worlds towards having a much healthier attitude towards grief, purely because we have more of a knowledge. And the last thing I want to mention is, for those of you who are local and live in the KwaZulu-Natal area, I am doing a grief workshop on the 27th of July. And if you're interested in attending, it's a morning only. Please contact me on my email, which is Sherry, spelled CHERRI, at lifevision.co.za. Sherry at lifevision.co.za. And I look forward to chatting to you next week for the 5th talk in the series on grief. Once again, I thank you so much for joining me.